So when we look at those new standards, they talk about us making sure that we are vocationally competent, at least to the level that we are delivering and assessing against. And what we find is that in our new units of competency, the revised training package format, sometimes in the assessment requirements for those new units, well, they also put some additional requirements in there. So sometimes in the assessment context section of those new standards, you're also going to find that there might be some additional requirements written in there. Often they are around currency, or if there is some kind of specific level of qualification, higher level of qualification, that might be the case. So for example, in the health training package, there's a unit in there which is about giving medications, and you have to hold a higher level unit in that area. In the RII training package, it talks about how much time you have to have spent in an industry to deliver and assess at particular AQF levels. So we have our standards sitting there as the basis for what we're talking about, but then sometimes there'll be some additional specification. Yes, please. Hear me now? Okay, is that better? Yes? Good. Okay. So when we're talking about vocational competence, in essence there's two ways that we could prove that we are vocationally competent. We could hold the unit that we're delivering and assessing against. That's one way for us to do it. Or the other way is to prove that we actually have that knowledge or skill, and we put a label on that in our sector and we call it equivalence. So we hold the unit or we prove equivalence to the unit. And most of us don't have any issue when it comes to holding the unit. It's when we prove equivalence that there's lots of questions that get asked. So the regulators have put out some guidance for us about proving equivalence. This is what they say. So they say that there's got to be a clear and verified relationship between whatever it is you're offering as evidence that you know what you're supposed to know and you can do what you're supposed to do, so your knowledge and skill, to the units that you're actually assessing against. Okay, so a clear and verified relationship. They're really important words. That within the RTO itself, someone decides that that is actually equivalent. So the RTO has to make a decision that it is equivalent, that you are actually competent to deliver and assess, and that you've got some evidence within the RTO to show that process that has happened.
So just I have some way lecturers basically mapped down to element one performance criteria level. Is that needed, or do you just need to map that down to this is a unit, generic, this is the equivalent, this is what we've done, experience in the industry? How would you map that? Would you map it down to the unit or drill that down?
Okay, so the question is like how much detail would you go into when you're, in this case, what Mark was saying is there's trainers and assessors have a mapping document, and that in fact is a very, very common tool that people use, and in ASQA's fact sheet they say you do a mapping. So whether you might do that at a unit level or whether you might go down to knowledge and skill. So my take on that is that when you're saying someone is competent to deliver and assess, you're talking about the unit as a whole. So your process that you go through must have taken into consideration what's in the unit as a whole. Whether you then choose to represent all of that in your mapping is a choice for your organisation. We need to be able to... I'm going to be tethered again. Sorry. Whether you choose to represent all of that is a choice for your organisation. However, you're going to need to be able to explain the process that you have been through. So most mapping documents that we see have some level of detail in them, because you've still got to line things up. I mean, in essence, you're saying someone's competent. I actually think it's a bit easier with the new units because you've got those very clear evidence requirements that sit in the majority of those new units. But it is a decision for your organisation to make. You know, it could be that this process that you go through happens through the recruitment process. It could be that it's like a lot of organisations now, the fact that we're dealing with this after the fact, that we're almost having to retrofit, often, causes us a little bit of grief. Excuse me. So when we make that decision of equivalence, that's a decision that only has value within our own RTO. So it's not something that someone can take with them to another organisation and say, well, when I was at ABC RTO, I was deemed equivalent. They can't take it to the next RTO and do the same thing. So it's a process that exists within your RTO, a decision that exists within your RTO. Some people, therefore, choose, and it is their choice, to go through an RPL process. There's a similar degree of rigour, and the reality is they have a qualification at the end of it. So for some people, their individual choice would be to do RPL rather than to do equivalence. Other people will choose to do equivalence, and again, within your organisations, the policy you set within your organisations, the terms and conditions that you put in your employment contracts are the things that decide what your staff do. So equivalence, we're talking about establishing the knowledge and skill of the trainer and assessor so that they can actually train and assess. And again, it's nothing that is really that is different to what we have been doing for a number of years now. So, any questions about vocational competence that you'd like to ask now? Yes.
This is something you might choose to do up here. So if, for example, the lecturer is up here for a certain course, how long does that remain valid evidence of their vocation? In our industry, it's a 2-year period.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any event you say that they have to do another appeal and continue to show evidence of how long do they have to keep
Okay.
that current?
So the question is, like if someone chooses to do RPL and let's say they get a certificate 4 in ABC, and so the question is how long does that certificate 4 in ABC stay current for in terms of their vocational competence, or would they have to keep doing RPLs? Well, if I put my evil twin hat on, I might be tempted to say they have to keep doing it, but absolutely not. We're talking about a unit of competency. We have 2 concepts in our sector. We have vocational competence. You know what you need to know, you can do what you need to do. We do that by holding the unit, and for the life of the unit, you've got it. Or we prove equivalence to it. So again, for the life of the unit, that decision, of equivalence stands. That concept of whether you're industry current or not is different. So you can be vocationally competent, but not industry current. So I could hold the qualification and have never worked in the industry and don't really know how the industry operates. So I might have got a qualification with a unit of competence in it, never been in there, 3 or 4 years later, I've got no idea what's happening in that sector. But vocational competence is about holding the unit or proving equivalence to it, and it's a decision that stands for the life of that unit. Okay, so in our sector you have to have both. So you have to have that vocational competence and the industry currency. You have to have both if you're going to train and assess. So let me be really clear. You have to have both. You have to be vocationally competent and industry current. It's not one or the other, it's both. You've got to have both. Yes?
Another question is, you know, coming out in community services aged care,
Mm.
that unit for any to provide evidence of skills that need to support to an elderly person, treatment people. So if a trainer's going to be able to deliver that unit,
Mm.
and we'll be back, you know, against that unit, and we'll be looking at all that criteria, theoretically they would have to go out there and give care to 3 different people.
They would have to show you evidence that they'd done that, and I would really hope that they had if they were training.
No, but they, of course,
Mm.
but how they may have done that a while ago.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the thing. So
yeah.
to maintain it, make sure it's current, probably do it every year or so.
So we're going to talk about currency next. So the question was around when you have a look at the new units of competency that are coming in the community services training package, some of those units of competency and in other training packages as well, talk about you have to having a particular amount of evidence. So they might say you have to have done this 2 times or 3 times or 10 times, whatever it is the unit says. So if you were looking at proving that someone is equivalent, would you then have to deal with that in that process? So you're saying they have the knowledge and skill that is required, and whatever they bring you in terms of evidence should meet the evidence requirements of that unit. And when it comes to, like, maybe they had been working in the industry sector maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it's a matter of figuring out whether that evidence that they bring to you can actually sit against that unit. So for some industry sectors, that time frame is not going to be an issue. For others, it'll be an enormous issue because they'll be very out of date in that time frame. So it really depends on what is current in your industry. Yes? Non-equivalent, yeah. Yes. So that, well, what I'm saying is that a trainer, so the question was with the community services training package, what's happened with the release of that training package is all the units have been made not equivalent in the training package. However, there are people who have older units that have knowledge and have skill. So what I'm saying is that you can look at the knowledge and skill that they do have and line it up against those new units, and it may be that it matches almost completely, and it may be that they have gaps that they have to address. So in the same way that it might be from some other qualification, if it was from an older community services qualification, it would be a matter of having a look at how well knowledge and skill does actually line up. Yes?
Just thinking about what you said about vocational competence lasts the length of the qualification process.
The unit, yep.
If you streamline them,
Mm.
all change,
Mm.
what implication does that have for all people who are lecturing on those?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, when you've got a qualification that is changing, then in essence, each time it changes, you're looking at your knowledge and skill and saying, does my knowledge and skill still line up with what's in those units? So sometimes those changes are dramatic and it's a significant job. Other times the changes are very little, but there would still be that comparison process where you went through and had a look at what was there and what's coming in the new and decide whether, or the organisation decides whether you're equivalent or not. So, when you have a look at our training packages and, some qualifications have a lot of units in them, other qualifications have a small number of units in them. Some RTOs have got trainers and assessors that deliver across multiple qualifications. They might be dealing with 60, 70 units of competency. Other people only deal with 1. So there's a massive, massive difference in, I guess, the amount of work that exists in this, depending upon the circumstances that you're in your RTO. And there's no doubt that the change of qualifications, part of your transitioning process from old qualification to new qualification is considering whether your trainers and assessors are vocationally competent for the new quals. Anything else you'd like to raise at this time? You can always ask later if we move on. Okay, so the other concept that sits in there with this is this idea of currency being industry current. Now, this gentleman, I don't know if any of you actually recognise who it is, but it's Walt Disney. So, at some point in time, Walt Disney was an ambulance driver. Whether he could still drive an ambulance today is a completely different question. Yes, but I'm sure he's got magical powers or something like that. So the idea that someone is industry current is about, the skills and the needs of industry today, not some period of time in the past. And the reality is, for different industries, the currency period changes, and there's a lot of things that influence currency within an industry area. So things like technological innovations, some industries are far more technology focused than others. As those things change, currency changes. Changes in legislation, changes in regulatory requirements, changes in industry practice, so you'll have like new and emerging practices within industries. And sometimes it's as simple as just the technical degradation of your skills because you're not doing it. So there's all kinds of things that in fact impact upon what a currency period might be in a particular industry area, and there is no one answer. So within your organisations, one of the first things you have to think about is really, what is currency for my industry? Now, having said that, some of the training packages, but it's few and far between, will actually give you an idea of what currency might mean for them. So for example, building and construction talk about you having been on a building and construction site within the past 3 years. So sometimes you will get a little bit of advice, but the majority of training packages are actually silent on what the currency period is for their training packages. So what you're doing is having a look at these issues, figuring out what currency is for you, and then making sure that the people who train and assess on your behalf actually understand how their knowledge and skill is used in industry today. So again, we have some guidance, from the regulators around what we need to be considering when we're thinking about currency. So we're looking for that you've actually established what currency mean, that it wasn't, like a pot shot at the dartboard to decide how many months was your currency period, that there's actually a logic behind the decisions that you've made, that you actually have established what it is people need to keep up to date with. So as we're looking at our engagement with industry to think about currency, what is it that we're trying to get out of those engagements? Are we just going out there and hanging out with them for a day? Or is there a purpose to what you're going to look for? We want to see the purpose in terms of what you're going out there for. That you've got some kind of program of development activities that your staff are going to undertake, and this is likely to be potentially at a team level, but also potentially at an individual level, depending upon what people are delivering and assessing. So whatever it is that individual has to keep up to date with, how are they going to do that? And that you've actually got evidence that you've participated in those activities that you planned for, that they did what you intended. So if it was about maintaining your skills on a lathe, did what you did for your development activity actually enable you to practice that and maintain that technical skill? If it's about gaining some knowledge about new management practices, how did you do that? Did you get what you needed out of that? So it's not an ad hoc process in your organisation. It's something that is quite planned and strategic. So that doesn't mean that every single person is going to do every single activity. Again, in terms of being strategic, you need to be thinking about what it is and how you can share information within your organisation. If you've got multiple people that need particular pieces of knowledge, does everyone have to go to that? Or maybe not. Maybe you send one person and then do some internal development where they share their knowledge. So there's all kinds of approaches that you can take, and you do really need to figure out what is going to work for you. Now, I know that this is an answer that typically the vet sector doesn't like very much. We like to be told exactly what it is we have to do. But this is one where we're never going to be able to do that. So you do need to figure out what is actually going to work for you. Now, there are some considerations that you might like to take into account. So, in our new regulatory standards, they've actually added a clause in there where they talk about your engagement with industry. And they now talk about your engagement with industry as needing to contribute to establishing the currency of your trainers and assessors. So while that is a concept that is not new, it is new for us to see it written explicitly like that in our regulatory standards. And I think all of us probably did that anyway. It's just now you have to prove that that's what you've done. So you need to think about when you're sending people out into industry, and typically you've been taking your strategies or your assessment tools out to them to have a look at. Part of what you're thinking about and planning for in that engagement with industry is making sure that you've got information around the currency of your assessors, your trainers and assessors at the same time. So both the regulators that operate here in Western Australia, TAC and ASQA, have both put out users guides that have information in them around vocational currency, vocational competence and industry currency. And both regulators have also put out fact sheets, and I'm going to just disappear from the microphone. Okay, so we have both have put out fact sheets, and they're both pretty clear in these fact sheets about the kinds of things that they are thinking about. So there's those points of reference for us to come back to when we're thinking about what we might need to consider. Now, there's also some research that's been done in the vet sector that sits around currency. But what they have done is they've actually called it a different name, and they've called it professional obsolescence. They're academics. They have to come up with these big names for it. But there's some very, very good principles that have been highlighted in that research for you to think about when you're thinking about how you might put this into place in your organisations. So they talk about you having a strategic approach to doing this. This is not something, it will become an extremely expensive activity if this is not something that you think about strategically in your organisation, particularly in much bigger organisations. So you have to think about, as a strategy, as a business strategy, how are you going to maintain the currency of your staff? So everyone needs to be involved in this, not just those that want to. Okay, so I guess what that's saying is you probably need to link it to other human resource-based procedures that exist within your organisation. Okay, this is really a requirement of employment now. So the idea is that you put some policies and processes in place in your organisation that are actually supportive of these kinds of development activities, that encourage people to be involved in these types of development activities and encourage them to share what they have learnt, to collaborate in this. So what that research is showing is that the best results tend to come from organisations where they have collaborative approaches to developing currency in their staff. Ideally, you'll provide staff with work that stretches them. Now I know that can sometimes be hard when people are employed for a particular role, but again, looking at work that or activities that are a distinct shift from their day-to-day routine, you get better results there. And the other thing is that as a primary motivator for this, that those activities have to contribute to making their primary job better. Okay, so when you think about those things that they know make a difference and make these programs effective, those are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about when you're planning these things. And that information actually sits in the TAC guidance note about currency. So these concepts, vocational competence and currency, are not new. The way they're specified in the standards now is not new. The only thing that is different is our standards now say, make sure you engage industry when you talk about the currency of your staff or when you're establishing the currency of your staff. So, questions or comments about currency? And silence was the stern reply. Mm-hmm.
That would be enough industry consultation to provide the industry registration certification.
Like,
our industry requires you to do 20 hours every.
Yep.
So often you register as a part.
Okay. So the question is, if there's an industry registration that requires you to undertake development activities, and sometimes it's set around particular activities, sometimes it's set around number of hours that you've done, is that enough to show that you are current? Okay. So my response to that would be, that is a decision that your organisation will make. They will have to look at what you have done in those hours and decide whether that's of any relationship to the units that you're delivering and assessing against. And let me give you an example. So in my industry, I belong to a professional body that requires me to undertake a CPD, and I have to get a number of points to maintain my level of registration. And I can do whatever I want to get my points as long as I get the right number of points. So I could do activities that are around training and assessment and auditing, and yes, I do, Kathy. However, they've also got some other stuff that I'm really interested in that has got nothing to do with what I train and assess, and to be very honest, I actually choose to do that instead because it's what interests me. So there are times, like if I chose the right activities within my professional membership, I would be able to use that against what I'm training and assessing against. Because I choose to do other things, it has no relationship to what I train and assess in. So even though I've maintained my professional membership, it's got nothing to do with what I train and assess against. So you have to look at what it is you're doing and whether it's got any relationship to what you're doing. Well, it all depends if it relates to the units you train and assess against. So sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. Chris? Yep. Mandy, are you the person who asked me the difficult question last time? What if you can't get industry engaged? Or you have to find a way to, I'm afraid. You know, it's a requirement of the standards, and I know that there are some industries that are a lot harder to get engaged than others, and maybe it's about chipping away at them. I don't know that there's not an option for us to not consider it, put it that way.
How about if you're training for a high-risk licence, such as forklift?
Yes.
If you hold a high-risk licence that's valid for 5 years, would that be considered the industry currency?
Okay, so the question is, if you, and I'll broaden it out to whatever industry. Okay, so the question was, if you hold a license within an industry and the license is valid for a period of time, does that mean you're industry current? So I would say not necessarily. Not necessarily, because things could change within that industry within that time period. And things could change within the units within that time period. So that engagement that you have with industry should tell you whether what's represented in that license, if that license actually lines up with what you're doing. Some industry areas it does, some it doesn't.
Even though the industry body has no trouble with you practicing at any time, whether continuously or intermittently through that, you're saying that the industry body who's happy for you to work under their auspices, essentially, so like an electrician, you're saying that I've got my license today, I'm going to take 2 years break backpacking, and then I'm going to come back, I've still got my license in date, check that there's nothing changed with the licensing body.
Oh, you've just made a very important statement. I've checked that there's nothing that's changed.
So from this perspective here, if nothing has changed and you've been recording that you yearly did an entry in the log that says, I have confirmed the licensing body has not changed the conditions of licensing, then would that be acceptable?
So when we're potentially, yes, potentially. So if you have, so the question was around if there is a licensing body that's happy for you to practice. Initially, we didn't have the checking, so I would say potentially that license could be okay, but you've got to check that nothing's changed. So if you didn't go through that check, I would say no. But if you had been through that check and nothing had changed and it was established as it was okay for currency, then potentially yes. So the question is, in terms of what evidence you might be able to use for currency, does it have to be paid professional work, or could it be that you're involved in the industry in some other way, and could you use that evidence? Well, I think potentially you could use that other evidence. There's nothing that says it has to be paid professional work, but your organisation that you work for would have to look at what it is you're doing, and they would make a decision about whether they're okay for you using that or not.
So therefore, if you go out to industry, as in visit one of your customers, and say, I need to spend some time in your workshop or environment to show that I'm up to speed, if you get your customer to sign up to say, yes, you've been there and you can do it, would that be sufficient evidence?
The question is, if you were going out to visit a customer and you got some verification from the customer that you're in their workshop and doing particular things, could you use that as evidence? Well, potentially you could, yes. And again, the decision about whether that is okay or not actually rests with your RTO. Yeah, then I'll come over there. Yep.
So I'm looking at healthcare trainers, parametric science. So our trainers, we call it industry experience, it's pretty close shop at St. Ambulance. Would simulations suffice, thoroughly the simulation for trainers, and sort of verify them? Simulation, is that still known as currency?
Okay, so the question is, if you're in an industry area where you can't actually go and do something, so there are some industry areas where, to me, that stands out as would probably be the case. So most of the emergency services would probably sit under that banner. You can't create an emergency or a fire, whatever it is, a disaster. So potentially could a simulation be used? Well, I would say potentially yes. So I hope you've noticed that I've not said yes or no to anything. I'm not that silly. And there's a very good reason for that, because potentially all of these things could be used. But within your organisation needs to figure out the strategy that they're going to put in place, and potentially simulation could be part. I mean, you know, I worked with submarines. We don't sink $1 billion submarine so we can teach you to escape from it. We just don't do it. Taxpayers don't like it. So, there are areas where potentially simulation could be involved. And again, same with any other simulation that we look at in terms of assessment. It's the quality of it. Does it really give you what you need to actually demonstrate that you have that skill? So, the reality is sometimes the answer is going to be yes. Not so long ago, I was looking at a confined space training where the person tried to convince me that the holes that they'd cut in the end of the cupboards actually represented a confined space that I was going to crawl through. No. No.
You keep saying like it's up to the RTO, which I understand. I have staff and it's qualification. But what about when I'm recruiting new trainers that come in? If they don't have that actual qualification, they're actually, as professionals, are going to have to start collecting and making sure that they've got evidence that they can take from an RTO so that they can be recruited quite easily into another RTO. And I know that doesn't really happen. Certainly with the maths and documents, I know it's a lot to do with the RTO, but there's going to have to be more responsibility onus on trainers and assessors to start collecting that evidence, whether or not internally we just give out, our own internal certificates so that they can use that. But how are you going to see that? Because you can see, I can see a lot of people being unrecruitable, or the market is a lot more competitive, and I don't expect a lot more when I'm actually recruiting new staff.
So the question sits around, and I think we're really talking about vocational competence as well as, yes. So when you have someone, the fact that that decision about equivalence only has value within the organisation that you work with, what responsibility then does the trainer and assessor who chooses to go through an equivalence pathway, what do they need to think about when they're looking at moving RTOs, and do they need to be looking at, do they put evidence portfolios together or whatever it is they choose to do? The reality is, if they choose to work as a trainer and assessor in the vet sector, then that's the requirement that sits in the sector. And so potentially they will need to think about what they do so that they are, transferable between RTOs. Yeah. Yes. And it is a choice to work in the sector.
I mean, as
Yeah.
an RTO as well, when we've got those staff, we should be, supporting them and providing
Yes.
them with that evidence.
Yes.
So they can do that rather than doing that.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a lot of things to consider. And, I think I mentioned earlier, some organisations will put in their employment contracts that you have to hold the qualification because they don't want to engage in equivalence processes, and that's their right to do that. The standards allow both processes to happen. As an individual organisation, you make a decision about what your organisation does. Yes?
What do you consider as being the expiry date of currency? Is this something that's going to be done annually? Is it within 2 years, 18 months, 5 years? I know we've had a license in New Zealand, we've had discussion about, I've checked with body, but how do I as an RTO determine that I, or on the trainers, has maintained currency? How can I use that yardstick to determine that?
There isn't one. So the question is is there a time period? What would I consider current? And there isn't a yardstick. And I want to make that message really clear. Like each RTO, depending on what you're delivering, is going to need to determine what currency is for that industry area. And that's not necessarily going to be a set number. So let me give you an example. If we had engaged with industry and we'd looked at their practices and we'd found that really nothing had changed in the last 3 years, we might say, if as long as our trainers and assessors have been involved within the past 3 years, then we're happy that they're current. And the next month, a whole lot of new regulation comes out. Your 3 years is blown out of the water. So you need to, the standards really require you to engage regularly with industry, and that engagement, and most RTOs do, that engagement should be telling you what's changing and how to keep up to date with those things. So that they're just, I'm really sorry, but there isn't just one answer of this is the time frame. Yes?
They talked a lot about the RTO's decision of what meets it. If we imagine that you've got a role as an auditor in your life, and you rock up, and they believe in this, in all of their processes that they have demonstrated a satisfactory level. What is a scenario where the auditor
Says no.
disagrees
Yes.
that they haven't justified it?
Yes.
What are those sort of, what's
Yep.
the flow-on process from that?
Yep. Okay. So the question was, an RTO's got a process in place where they've decided how they're going to go about looking at competence and currency. They believe their process is rock solid. We get to audit and the auditor says no. What's the process from there? Well, in any audit, and not just in terms of vocational competence and currency, any decision that an auditor makes, in the same way as within your assessment processes, you have an appeal process, well, you also have an appeal process out of the audit. It's called disputing the audit findings. And so TAC has a process, as does ASQA, where if you disagree with the finding of the auditor, then you can make that representation through to TAC and they will investigate that. Good, got that right. Yeah. Yeah. And the form is available off TAC's website. Yes. And then I'll come back here.
Is every regulator now going to have an industry expert and their audit to be able to, not all auditors are experts in every industry, you know what it is.
Aren't we? Oh, that was a rude shock. That's true.
Strategic industry audit
Yes.
focus, but you
Yes.
know what the latest dementia care
Yes.
things are happening.
Yes.
So we could easily say, oh, that is the latest one.
And how would we know any different?
So you'll have to have industry.
Well, we don't necessarily have industry there. We can choose to have industry there, but we also have a lot of information that's available to us. TAC has relationships with the training councils where, we get updates about things, we get industry intelligence and that gets provided to us. And in part of preparing for audits, if it's something that we're really uncertain about, then it's also part of our role as an auditor to do our research. Yes?
That was my question too, is whether the auditors will have industry currency as well.
Well, we do in auditing. But not necessarily, well, there are some of us who have specialisations in particular areas, and if we are uncertain about a particular area, then we have the capacity to bring an industry expert with us, and TAC has relationships set up with people to enable us to do that.
And that will be some of us industry currency.
Yes.
How about an enterprise RTO where the trained assessors are working full-time in the job? Would they need to put together a strategic process to make sure to prove that their trained assessors are doing their job all day, every day?
Okay. So the question is around enterprise RTOs. And so in some enterprise RTOs, the trainers and assessors are actively involved in the work. In other enterprise RTOs, the trainers and assessors aren't involved in the work at all. So it really depends on the nature of what happens there as to what kinds of process the organisation will put in place. So as an RTO, you have to prove that your people are current. So if you have got people engaged in the workplace all the time and they're doing the work that they're teaching, it will be very, very easy for you to prove that they are current. If you're in an enterprise RTO where that is not the case, then you need to think about how you're going to do that. And also, one of the things that enterprise RTO, a little trap that they tend to fall into, is our standards don't talk about enterprise or employer-specific currency. They talk about industry currency. So sometimes you'll find an enterprise RTO where their practice is reflective of broader industry practice. Sometimes you'll find enterprise RTOs where their practice is really very, very specific to them as an employer. And there are things that they don't do, or additional things that they do, that other employers within the same industry don't. So our standards always talk about industry, they don't talk about enterprise or employer. So that you need to have had that broader look to decide whether the practice matches or not.
Following on from that,
Mm.
where does everyone stand in the construction industry that in the Perth region, the building technique does not reflect the full suite of competencies from Cert 3 in carpentry or carpentry and joinery, in that 80 to 85% of carpenters are brick carpenters, so gut wall, bricklayers are building double brick, doing no brick veneer, yet that's
in the standard.
of requirement within it. Therefore, the most current people in the training providers here are actually the lecturing and training staff within site RTOs.
So the question sits around the fact that in some industry areas, and we are special here in Western Australia, apparently we don't build chimneys either. I've got 2 in my house, but that sometimes there's industry practice that just doesn't match what's in the training package. So sometimes it's around methods of doing things, sometimes it's around the use of tools, and what do we do in those circumstances when that is not something that is actually practiced in industry here? Well, the first thing is talk to the writers of the training package to see if they can look at that wording that is in the training package so it gives some choice. If it doesn't, then the RTO, when they figure out how to train and assess, if they're using a workplace, for example, then they might say, all of those things can be done in a workplace. This is a requirement of the training package. It's not done in the workplace. We need to set up a simulation to teach people to do that and to assess them. Yes. Any other questions or comments? We've still got about 5 minutes. Any other questions or comments? Yes. So the question is around, with some of the lower level or more general qualifications, so general education type qualifications, how do you demonstrate your competence? And in essence, it's something that you do every day. So whatever process your organisation puts in place to establish competence and currency, then you would be using that evidence from your workplace to demonstrate that. So if it's, for example, something like maybe using a word processing package, then you can use the evidence from your daily work to show that you have that competence. It would be whoever the person is within the process in your organisation. So obviously some of this is a little bit hard. So the question was, who verifies it? So my response is, whoever your process says verifies it. Now, in smaller organisations, we have a lot of one-person RTOs here in Western Australia. That can be a little challenging. Sometimes those organisations choose to work together. They have partnerships with other RTOs where they start to look at all of those kinds of things. But fundamentally, our standards only ever say what. They don't say how. So I've said to you a lot of times, it depends what your organisation decides to do. It depends on your process. That response is because of the way our standards are written. Our standards leave the how up to you. And then you just need to demonstrate in audit that how you have chosen to do it does actually work. So thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. I know it's a hard thing. So I wish you all the best of luck with looking at currency and competency. And remember that there's a lot of guidance available out there for you to refer back to. And it's a concept we're used to. So thank you.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.